Question 1. Consider a scenario where a client of Hoya Hiring Assessment tests financial advisory services, a long-standing and otherwise reputable business, begins to engage in a series of complex transactions that appear unusual and potentially designed to circumvent standard reporting requirements. You have a professional obligation to both your client and to uphold regulatory standards. What is the most appropriate course of action for an employee of Hoya Hiring Assessment test in this situation? Option A. Ignore the unusual transactions to avoid jeopardizing the client relationship and potential future business. Option B. Directly confront the client about your suspicions and demand an explanation before taking any further steps. Option C. Conduct a thorough internal review of the transaction. Consult with Hoya Hiring Assessment Test's compliance department and follow their guidance on reporting obligations. Option D. Immediately report the suspicious transactions to the relevant regulatory authorities without further internal consultation. The correct answer is D. Immediately report the suspicious transactions to the relevant regulatory authorities without further internal consultation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing client confidentiality with the potential need to report suspicious activity, all within the strict confines of the Hoya Hiring Assessment Test's specified regulatory framework. The pressure to maintain client trust is significant. Failing to adhere to regulatory reporting obligations can have severe consequences for both the individual and the firm. Careful judgment is required to discern when a client's actions cross the line from legitimate business activity to potential regulatory breaches. The correct approach involves a thorough internal review and consultation with the compliance department before taking any external action. This approach is correct because it prioritizes adherence to the specified regulatory framework by ensuring that any reporting is done through the proper channels and based on a well-founded suspicion, not mere conjecture. It respects client confidentiality by not prematurely disclosing information and allows for expert guidance to determine the appropriate course of action according to the law and internal policies. This aligns with the ethical duty to act with integrity and diligence, and the regulatory obligation to report suspicious activities when required. An incorrect approach of immediately reporting the client's activities to the authorities without internal consultation is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a lack of due diligence and potentially breaches client confidentiality prematurely. It bypasses the firm's internal controls and compliance procedures, which are designed to ensure accurate and appropriate reporting. Such an action could lead to unnecessary alarm, damage the client relationship, and potentially result in regulatory scrutiny for the firm if the suspicion proves unfounded or if the reporting process was mishandled. Another incorrect approach of ignoring the client's activities due to a desire to avoid conflict or potential loss of business is also professionally unacceptable. This failure represents a dereliction of duty and a violation of regulatory obligations. It demonstrates a lack of integrity and a disregard for the potential for financial crime or other illicit activities. By not investigating or reporting, the professional risks becoming complicit in or enabling illegal actions, which carries significant legal and ethical repercussions. The professional reasoning framework that should be used in such situations involves a systematic process. First, identify the potential issue and its implications. Second, consult the relevant regulatory framework and internal policies to understand obligations and procedures. Third, gather all necessary information and conduct a preliminary assessment. Fourth, escalate the matter internally to the compliance department or legal counsel for expert advice. Fifth, act in accordance with the guidance received, ensuring all actions are documented and justifiable. This structured approach ensures that decisions are informed, compliant, and ethically sound, protecting both the client and the firm. Question 2. The risk matrix shows a moderate risk associated with a new client for Hoya, primarily due to incomplete Know Your Customer (KIC) information regarding their previous business dealings. The compliance officer needs to obtain further details about the client's financial history to accurately assess this risk. Which of the following actions best represents a compliant and ethical approach for the compliance officer to take? Option A. Directly contact the client's former business partners to gather information about their financial history, explaining the need for Hoya's assessment. Option B. Rely on publicly available news articles and social media profiles of the client to infer their financial history. Option C. Initiate a formal internal request to Hoya's client onboarding team, specifying the exact information required and the regulatory basis for the request. To obtain the necessary KYC details, Option D. Proceed with the client onboarding process, assuming the moderate risk is acceptable given the potential business opportunity. Correct answer is A. Directly contact the client's former business partners to gather information about their financial history, explaining the need for Hoya's assessment. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the immediate need for information with the regulatory obligation to protect client confidentiality. The compliance officer at Hoya must navigate potential conflicts between business objectives and legal/ethical duties. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any information gathering does not inadvertently breach privacy regulations or professional conduct standards. The correct approach involves a structured, compliant process for obtaining the necessary information. This means initiating a formal request through established internal channels, clearly articulating the business need for the information, and ensuring that the request is directed to the appropriate department within Hoya that is authorized to access and disclose such data, adhering strictly to Hoya's internal data access policies and relevant data protection laws. This approach upholds client confidentiality by ensuring that information is only accessed and shared through authorized, documented procedures, minimizing the risk of unauthorized disclosure and demonstrating a commitment to regulatory compliance. An incorrect approach would be to bypass formal channels and directly contact the client's former employer. This action would likely violate data protection principles by attempting to obtain information without proper authorization or consent, potentially breaching confidentiality agreements and professional conduct rules. Another incorrect approach would be to rely on informal inquiries or publicly available information that might be incomplete or inaccurate, failing to meet the standard of due diligence and potentially leading to misinformed decisions. A third incorrect approach would be to proceed with the assessment without the necessary information, thereby failing to adequately assess the risk and potentially exposing Hoya to undue liability. Professionals should use a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves first identifying the specific regulatory requirements applicable to the situation, then assessing the potential risks and benefits of different courses of action, and finally selecting the approach that best aligns with legal obligations, company policy, and professional ethics. When in doubt, seeking guidance from legal or compliance departments is crucial. Question 3. The investigation demonstrates that a Hoya hiring assessment test candidate, while reviewing application materials, inadvertently accessed a section containing sensitive personal data of other candidates. This candidate is now considering how to proceed. Option A. Share the information about the data breach with a trusted colleague outside of the Hoya hiring assessment test process to seek advice on how to handle the situation. Option B. Use the accessed information to gain an advantage in their own assessment by understanding the profiles of other candidates. Option C. Delete the accessed data from their temporary files and proceed as if the incident never occurred to avoid potential complications. Option D. Immediately report the accidental access to the Hoya hiring assessment test administrators, detailing the nature of the data accessed and requesting guidance on secure data handling. The correct answer is D. Immediately report the accidental access to the Hoya hiring assessment test administrators, detailing the nature of the data accessed and requesting guidance on secure data handling. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Hoya hiring assessment test candidates are expected to demonstrate a nuanced understanding of regulatory compliance and ethical conduct within the specific framework of the Hoya hiring assessment test. The challenge lies in applying these principles accurately to a hypothetical situation, requiring careful judgment to distinguish between compliant and non-compliant actions. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the Hoya hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework and ethical guidelines, particularly concerning data privacy and client confidentiality. This approach is right because it prioritizes adherence to the established rules, ensuring that Hoya hiring assessment test candidates act with integrity and protect sensitive information as mandated by the assessment's governing principles. This aligns with the core tenets of professional conduct expected of individuals undergoing such assessments. An incorrect approach that involves sharing confidential candidate information without explicit consent would fail to meet the regulatory requirements of the Hoya hiring assessment test. This would constitute a breach of privacy and confidentiality, potentially leading to disciplinary action or disqualification from the assessment. Another incorrect approach, such as disregarding the assessment's specific data handling protocols, would demonstrate a lack of diligence and an unwillingness to follow established procedures, thereby failing to meet the assessment standards for professional conduct. A third incorrect approach, which might involve making assumptions about candidate suitability without adhering to the prescribed assessment criteria, would undermine the fairness and objectivity of the evaluation process, directly contravening the assessment's purpose. Professionals should approach such situations by first identifying the specific regulatory and ethical obligations relevant to the Hoya hiring assessment test. They should then evaluate potential actions against these obligations, prioritizing compliance and ethical considerations. If there is any ambiguity, seeking clarification from the assessment administrators or referring to the official guidelines is paramount. This systematic process ensures that decisions are well-founded, defensible, and aligned with the highest professional standards. Question 4. The analysis reveals that a key client of Hoya hiring assessment test has requested a modification to the standard assessment protocol for a candidate, citing specific personal circumstances. The requested modification, if implemented, would deviate from the established assessment procedures designed to ensure fairness and validity as outlined in the Hoya hiring assessment test's regulatory compliance guidelines. As a compliance officer, what is the most appropriate course of action? Option A. Refuse the client's request outright without any further discussion or explanation, as any deviation from protocol is unacceptable. Option B. Immediately implement the client's requested modification to maintain client satisfaction, assuming the client has valid reasons. Option C. Lightly inform the client that the requested modification cannot be accommodated due to the strict adherence required by the Hoya hiring assessment test's regulatory framework, and offer to explore alternative, compliant solutions that might address the underlying need. Option D. Proceed with the modification, but make a note in the candidate's file that the protocol was altered at the client's request, hoping this internal documentation will suffice. Correct answer is B. Immediately implement the client's requested modification to maintain client satisfaction, assuming the client has valid reasons. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for a compliance officer at Hoya hiring assessment test due to the potential conflict between client instructions and regulatory obligations. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need to satisfy a client's request with the imperative to adhere strictly to the Hoya hiring assessment test's established regulatory framework and ethical guidelines. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any action taken does not inadvertently lead to a breach of these regulations, which could have significant reputational and legal consequences for Hoya hiring assessment test. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the Hoya hiring assessment test's internal policies and the relevant regulatory framework to determine if the client's request can be accommodated without violating any rules. If the request is found to be non-compliant, the professional duty is to clearly and politely explain the limitations imposed by the regulations and offer alternative compliance solutions. This upholds the integrity of Hoya hiring assessment test's assessment processes and demonstrates a commitment to ethical conduct and regulatory adherence. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's request without verifying its compliance. This demonstrates a failure to uphold professional responsibility and a disregard for the regulatory framework governing Hoya hiring assessment test. Another incorrect approach is to simply refuse the client's request without providing any explanation or offering alternatives. While this avoids a regulatory breach, it fails to demonstrate a client-centric approach and the professional skill of finding compliant solutions. Finally, attempting to subtly circumvent the regulations to fulfill the client's request, even with good intentions, is a serious ethical and regulatory failure, as it undermines the integrity of the assessment process and exposes Hoya hiring assessment test to significant risk. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Understanding the client's request. 2. Consulting the relevant regulatory framework and internal policies. 3. assessing the request against these guidelines. 4. If compliant, proceeding with clear communication. 5. If non-compliant, explaining the limitations and proposing compliant alternatives. 6. Documenting all interactions and decisions. Question 5. The control framework reveals that a long-standing client of Hoya Financial Services has requested an immediate transfer of a significant sum of funds to an overseas account that has not been previously used by the client. The client states this is for an urgent personal investment opportunity. What is the most appropriate course of action for Hoya Financial Services? Option A. Conduct a thorough review of the client's request, including verifying the client's identity, assessing the legitimacy of the transaction through enhanced due diligence, and documenting all findings and decisions in accordance with Hoya Financial Services AML and KYC policies. Option B. Immediately process the transfer as requested by the client to maintain good client relations and meet their urgent needs. Option C. Attempt to find a way to expedite the transfer by bypassing some of the standard verification steps, given the client's long-standing relationship with Hoya Financial Services. Option D. Inform the client that such a transfer cannot be facilitated due to the unusual nature of the request, and advise them to seek alternative banking arrangements. Correct answer is B. Immediately process the transfer as requested by the client to maintain good client relations and meet their urgent needs. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preference and the firm's regulatory obligations. Hoya Financial Services must navigate the delicate balance of client service while upholding the integrity of its compliance procedures. The core difficulty lies in ensuring that client requests, even those seemingly straightforward, are processed in a manner that strictly adheres to the established regulatory framework, preventing potential breaches of conduct. The correct approach involves a thorough, documented review of the client's request against the firm's internal policies and relevant regulatory guidance. This ensures that any action taken is not only compliant, but also auditable. Specifically, it requires Hoya Financial Services to verify the client's identity and the legitimacy of the transaction through established Know Your Customer (KIC) and anti-money laundering (AML) procedures. This aligns with the regulatory imperative to prevent financial crime and maintain market integrity. The firm's duty of care extends to ensuring that client instructions, while respected, do not inadvertently facilitate illicit activities or violate any regulatory requirements. An incorrect approach would be to immediately process the client's request without further scrutiny. This bypasses critical control mechanisms designed to detect and prevent fraud or money laundering, directly violating AML regulations and potentially exposing Hoya Financial Services to significant legal and reputational risks. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's request outright without a proper review or explanation. This could be seen as poor client service and might also fail to identify a legitimate, albeit unusual, transaction that could be processed compliantly with appropriate due diligence. Finally, attempting to find a loophole or a workaround to satisfy the client's request while circumventing established procedures is a clear breach of ethical conduct and regulatory compliance, demonstrating a disregard for the control framework. Professionals should approach such situations by prioritizing a risk-based assessment. This involves understanding the potential risks associated with a client's request, consulting relevant internal policies and external regulations, and documenting all steps taken and decisions made. When in doubt, seeking guidance from the compliance department or legal counsel is paramount. The decision-making process should always be guided by the principle of acting with integrity and in accordance with the spirit and letter of the law. Question 6. To address the challenge of ensuring client data privacy while leveraging data analytics for improved service offerings at Hoya Hiring Assessment Test, which of the following strategies best aligns with regulatory requirements and ethical best practices? Option A. Implementing a comprehensive data governance framework that includes strict access controls, data minimization principles, and regular employee training on data protection obligations, ensuring all data processing activities are documented and justified under applicable regulations. Option B. Utilizing client contact information for direct marketing campaigns by third-party vendors, with the understanding that clients implicitly consent to such communications by engaging with Hoya Hiring Assessment Test services. Option C. Sharing aggregated client data with external research partners to identify market trends, assuming that anonymization techniques render the data non-personal and thus outside the scope of data protection laws. Option D. Developing advanced analytical models using all available client data without explicit consent for each specific use case, arguing that the potential benefits to clients outweigh the need for granular permission. Correct answer is A. Implementing a comprehensive data governance framework that includes strict access controls, data minimization principles, and regular employee training on data protection obligations, ensuring all data processing activities are documented and justified under applicable regulations. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Hoya Hiring Assessment Test, as a financial services firm, operates under stringent regulatory oversight. The core of the challenge lies in balancing the need for efficient data processing and client service with the absolute imperative of adhering to data privacy regulations. Misinterpreting or misapplying these regulations can lead to severe consequences, including regulatory fines, reputational damage, and loss of client trust. Careful judgment is required to ensure that all data handling practices are compliant and ethically sound. The correct approach involves a thorough understanding of the specific data protection laws applicable to Hoya Hiring Assessment Test operations and implementing robust internal policies and training programs that reflect these requirements. This ensures that all employees are aware of their responsibilities regarding client data, including how it can be collected, stored, processed, and shared. The regulatory justification stems from the fundamental principles of data protection, which mandate that personal data must be processed lawfully, fairly, and transparently, and only for specified, explicit, and legitimate purposes. Consent, data minimization, accuracy, storage limitation, integrity, and confidentiality are all key pillars that must be upheld. An incorrect approach that involves sharing client data with third-party marketing firms without explicit, informed consent from the clients fails to uphold the principle of lawful processing and transparency. This constitutes a direct violation of data protection regulations, as it exposes sensitive client information to unauthorized use and potential misuse. Another incorrect approach, which is to assume that anonymized data is exempt from all data protection regulations, is also flawed. While anonymized data may have fewer restrictions, the process of anonymization itself must be robust, and if re-identification is possible, the data may still fall under regulatory purview. Furthermore, failing to conduct regular audits of data handling practices leaves Hoya Hiring Assessment Test vulnerable to undetected breaches and noncompliance, undermining the principle of accountability. Professionals should adopt a decision-making framework that prioritizes regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. This involves 1. Identifying the relevant regulatory framework applicable to Hoya Hiring Assessment Test. 2. Assessing the specific data handling activity against the requirements of that framework. 3. Seeking legal or compliance advice when in doubt. 4. Implementing clear, documented policies and procedures. 5. Providing comprehensive training to all staff. 6. Regularly reviewing and auditing data handling practices to ensure ongoing compliance. Question 7. The review process indicates a serious allegation of data mishandling has been raised against a senior employee at Hoya. The employee in question is known to have a close working relationship with the direct manager who would typically oversee such internal matters. What is the most appropriate initial step for Hoya to take to address this allegation? Option A. Have the direct manager, who has a close working relationship with the accused employee, conduct a swift internal review to ascertain the facts. Option B. Inform the accused employee of the specific allegations and request their immediate written defense before any evidence is collected. Option C. Dismiss the allegation as unsubstantiated without further inquiry, given the potential for internal disputes to be exaggerated. Option D. Immediately initiate a formal, independent investigation, potentially involving an external third party or a dedicated internal compliance team with no prior involvement in the employee's department. Correct answer is D. Immediately initiate a formal, independent investigation, potentially involving an external third party or a dedicated internal compliance team with no prior involvement in the employee's department. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing client confidentiality with the need to address potential misconduct within Hoya. The firm's reputation and client trust are at stake, necessitating a careful and ethical response that adheres strictly to regulatory guidelines. The core tension lies in investigating a serious allegation without prejudicing the outcome or violating privacy rights. The correct approach involves initiating a formal, independent investigation. This is crucial because it ensures objectivity and impartiality, which are fundamental ethical principles and often regulatory requirements for handling internal complaints or allegations of misconduct. By engaging an external party or a designated internal compliance team with no prior involvement, Hoya demonstrates a commitment to a fair and thorough process. This approach aligns with best practices for corporate governance and regulatory compliance, as it provides a structured mechanism to gather evidence, interview relevant parties, and reach a well-substantiated conclusion. Such a process is designed to protect all individuals involved and to ensure that any disciplinary actions are based on facts, thereby upholding Hoya's integrity and its obligations to regulatory bodies. An incorrect approach would be to dismiss the allegation without a proper inquiry. This fails to uphold the duty of care owed to employees and clients, and it risks allowing potential misconduct to continue unchecked, which could lead to significant regulatory penalties and reputational damage for Hoya. Another incorrect approach is to conduct a superficial review by a manager with a close personal relationship to the accused. This compromises the integrity of the investigation due to the inherent conflict of interest and lack of objectivity, making it impossible to establish facts impartially. This approach would likely violate principles of fairness and due process, and could be seen as an attempt to cover up or minimize the issue, leading to severe regulatory repercussions and loss of trust. A third incorrect approach is to immediately inform the accused of the allegations and solicit their defense before any evidence has been gathered. While fairness dictates that individuals should be informed of accusations, doing so prematurely without a structured investigation can lead to evidence tampering, witness intimidation, or the destruction of relevant information, thereby undermining the entire investigative process and potentially violating regulatory requirements for a proper inquiry. Professionals should approach such situations by first recognizing the seriousness of the allegation and the need for a structured, unbiased investigation. This involves consulting internal policies and relevant regulatory guidance to determine the appropriate protocol. The decision-making process should prioritize fairness, confidentiality, and adherence to legal and ethical standards, ensuring that all parties are treated equitably and that the investigation is conducted with the utmost integrity. Question 8. What factors determine the appropriate course of action for Hoya when a client requests a financial product that may not be fully compliant with the firm's internal risk assessment guidelines, but the client insists it meets their specific needs? Option A. The primary determinant is the perceived likelihood of the client complaining if their request is denied, prioritizing client appeasement to avoid future disputes. Option B. The primary determinant is the client's explicit instruction and stated satisfaction with the product, overriding internal risk assessments if the client expresses strong conviction. Option C. The primary determinant is the potential for Hoya to generate significant commission revenue from the sale, as this incentivizes the firm to find solutions that meet client demands. Option D. The primary determinant is a thorough understanding and application of the relevant regulatory framework and Hoya's internal compliance policies, ensuring any product offered is both suitable for the client and compliant with all legal and ethical obligations. The correct answer is B. The primary determinant is the client's explicit instruction and stated satisfaction with the product, overriding internal risk assessments if the client expresses strong conviction. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Hoya, as a financial services firm, operates under strict regulatory oversight. The decision-maker must balance client interests with regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. The challenge lies in identifying and prioritizing the most critical factors when faced with potentially conflicting demands or incomplete information, ensuring that all actions align with the established regulatory framework. The correct approach prioritizes understanding the specific regulatory requirements applicable to Hoya's operations and the client's situation. This involves a thorough review of relevant legislation, industry guidelines, and internal policies. By focusing on the regulatory framework first, the professional ensures that any decision made is legally sound and ethically defensible, thereby protecting both the client and Hoya from potential sanctions or reputational damage. This aligns with the fundamental principle of acting in the client's best interest while adhering to the law, a cornerstone of financial services regulation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on the client's immediate stated preference, without considering the regulatory implications, would be professionally unacceptable. This could lead to advice or actions that are non-compliant, exposing the client to risk and Hoya to regulatory penalties. Another incorrect approach that prioritizes Hoya's internal profit motives over regulatory obligations or client well-being is also a clear ethical and regulatory failure. Such an approach undermines trust and violates the fiduciary duty expected of financial professionals. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core issue, gathering all relevant information, including regulatory requirements, evaluating potential courses of action against these requirements and ethical principles, and then selecting the most appropriate and compliant path. This iterative process ensures that all critical factors are considered and that decisions are well-reasoned and defensible. Question 9. System analysis indicates that a key client of Hoya Financial Services has requested a specific investment strategy that, while potentially offering short-term gains, appears to skirt the edges of regulatory guidelines concerning disclosure and risk profiling, as defined by the Hoya Hiring Assessment Test's jurisdiction. The client is a significant source of revenue, and the relationship is long-standing. Your immediate supervisor is keen to accommodate the client's request to maintain the business relationship. What is the most appropriate course of action for a Hoya Financial Services employee in this situation? Option A. Implement the strategy as requested by the client, but subtly alter the risk disclosure documentation to make it appear compliant without explicitly misleading the client. Option B. Proceed with the client's requested strategy, assuming the client understands and accepts any implicit risks, and document the conversation to mitigate potential future issues. Option C. Advise the client that the requested strategy cannot be implemented due to potential regulatory noncompliance, and explore alternative, compliant strategies that align with their risk tolerance and the firm's ethical standards. Option D. Inform the client that while the strategy is risky, it is permissible under current regulations and proceed with implementation, without further investigation into the nuances of the regulatory framework. Correct answer is C. Advise the client that the requested strategy cannot be implemented due to potential regulatory noncompliance, and explore alternative, compliant strategies that align with their risk tolerance and the firm's ethical standards. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing a client's immediate financial interests with the firm's ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The pressure to retain a valuable client can create a conflict of interest, potentially leading to compromised judgment. Careful consideration of the firm's fiduciary duties and the specific regulatory framework governing its operations is paramount. The correct approach involves prioritizing regulatory compliance and ethical conduct over immediate client retention. This means clearly communicating the limitations and risks associated with the proposed strategy to the client, even if it means potentially losing their business. The firm has a duty to act in the best interests of its clients, which includes providing honest and accurate advice, and not engaging in practices that could be deemed misleading or non-compliant with regulatory standards. Adhering to the Hoya Hiring Assessment Test's specified regulatory framework, which likely emphasizes principles of integrity, client care, and adherence to rules, is essential. An incorrect approach would be to proceed with the client's preferred strategy without fully disclosing the risks or potential regulatory breaches. This could lead to severe consequences, including regulatory sanctions, reputational damage, and legal liabilities for both the firm and the individuals involved. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's concerns outright without a thorough review, as this could be seen as poor client service and a failure to understand the client's objectives, even if those objectives are ultimately unachievable within regulatory bounds. A third incorrect approach might involve attempting to find a loophole or a technically compliant but ethically questionable solution, which still undermines the spirit of the regulations and the firm's commitment to integrity. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with identifying the core ethical and regulatory issues. This involves understanding the client's request, assessing it against the firm's policies and the relevant regulatory framework, and considering the potential consequences of various actions. Open and honest communication with the client, explaining the rationale behind any recommendations or limitations, is crucial. If a client's request cannot be met ethically or legally, the professional should clearly articulate why and explore alternative, compliance solutions. Escalating the matter to senior management or compliance departments for guidance is also a vital step when faced with complex ethical or regulatory dilemmas. Question 10. The assessment process reveals that a prospective client, Mr. Smith, has approached Hoya Financial Services expressing a strong interest in a specific high-yield investment product that is known to generate a significant commission for Hoya. Mr. Smith has provided minimal detail about his current financial situation or investment goals. Which of the following represents the most professional and compliant approach for the Hoya Financial Services advisor? Option A. Proceed with recommending the high-yield investment product to Mr. Smith, as he has expressed a clear interest and it aligns with Hoya's commission structure. Option B. Decline to discuss any specific products until Mr. Smith provides a detailed financial plan and investment objectives, explaining the importance of suitability. Option C. Recommend a diversified portfolio of lower commission products that may not align with Mr. Smith's stated interest but are generally considered safer. Option D. Immediately recommend the high-yield investment product, but verbally disclose that it offers a higher commission to Hoya Financial Services. Correct answer is A. Proceed with recommending the high-yield investment product to Mr. Smith, as he has expressed a clear interest and it aligns with Hoya's commission structure. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the immediate needs of a client with the long-term integrity of the financial advice provided, all within the strict confines of the Hoya Hiring Assessment Test's regulatory framework. The assessment process is designed to evaluate a candidate's ability to navigate these complexities ethically and in compliance with applicable rules. Careful judgment is required to ensure that recommendations are not only suitable for the client, but also align with regulatory expectations regarding disclosure, suitability, and avoiding conflicts of interest. The correct approach involves prioritizing a comprehensive understanding of the client's financial situation and objectives before making any recommendations. This aligns with the core principles of financial advice, which mandate that recommendations must be suitable for the client's individual circumstances. Specifically, under the regulatory framework governing financial advice, as implied by the Hoya Hiring Assessment Test's jurisdiction, which we assume to be a jurisdiction with robust consumer protection laws similar to those found in the UK or US financial services sectors. Advisors have a duty to conduct thorough due diligence. This includes understanding the client's risk tolerance, financial capacity, investment knowledge, and objectives. Recommending a product without this foundational understanding would be a breach of this duty, potentially leading to unsuitable advice and regulatory sanctions. An incorrect approach would be to immediately recommend the product that offers the highest commission to Hoya Financial Services. This is ethically problematic, as it prioritizes the firm's financial gain over the client's best interests, creating a clear conflict of interest. Regulatory frameworks typically require disclosure of such conflicts, and in many cases, prohibit advice that is demonstrably not in the client's best interest due to such conflicts. Another incorrect approach would be to proceed with the recommendation based solely on the client's stated interest in a particular product without further investigation. This fails to meet the suitability requirements, as the client's stated interest may not reflect their true needs or capacity to manage the associated risks. Finally, recommending a product that is overly complex or aggressive for the client's profile, even if it aligns with their stated interest, would also be a failure of professional duty, as it neglects the advisor's responsibility to ensure the client understands and can manage the investment. Professionals should adopt a decision-making process that begins with a thorough client discovery phase. This involves active listening, asking probing questions, and gathering all relevant financial information. Following this, advisors should analyze the gathered information to identify suitable investment options that align with the client's objectives and risk profile. Any potential conflicts of interest should be identified and managed transparently, with full disclosure to the client. Recommendations should then be presented clearly, explaining the rationale, risks, and benefits, ensuring the client can make an informed decision. This systematic approach ensures compliance with regulatory obligations and upholds ethical standards. Question 11. The audit findings indicate potential procedural gaps in how Hoya hiring assessment test handles client data, specifically concerning data retention and access controls. Which of the following approaches best addresses these findings while adhering to regulatory requirements? Option A. Immediately revise data handling procedures based on the audit report and disseminate the new procedures to all staff. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the audit findings with the compliance and legal departments, develop a revised operational procedure, obtain senior management approval, and then communicate the updated procedure to all relevant staff. Option C. Implement minor adjustments to data retention policies in the departments directly mentioned in the audit findings. Option D. Prioritize addressing the findings only if they directly impact client service delivery. Otherwise, consider them low priority. Correct answer is A. Immediately revise data handling procedures based on the audit report and disseminate the new procedures to all staff. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing operational efficiency with the imperative of regulatory compliance and client trust. The audit findings at Hoya hiring assessment test suggest potential weaknesses in the process for handling client data, which, if not addressed proactively and appropriately, could lead to significant reputational damage, regulatory penalties, and loss of client confidence. The core tension lies in the need to implement changes quickly to rectify issues, while ensuring these changes themselves are compliant and do not introduce new risks. Careful judgment is required to select an approach that is both effective in addressing the audit findings and adheres strictly to the regulatory framework governing Hoya hiring assessment tests operations. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the identified audit findings by the compliance and legal departments, followed by the development of a revised operational procedure that is then formally approved by senior management and communicated to all relevant staff. This approach is correct because it ensures that any changes made to Hoya hiring assessment test processes are not only effective in addressing the audit concerns, but are also legally sound and compliant with all applicable regulations. Engaging the compliance and legal teams guarantees that the revised procedures align with the regulatory framework. Formal approval by senior management signifies accountability and commitment to rectifying the issues, while clear communication ensures consistent implementation across the organization. This structured methodology minimizes the risk of introducing new compliance breaches or operational errors. An incorrect approach that involves immediately implementing changes based solely on the audit report, without further review by compliance and legal teams, is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for the regulatory framework. Such an approach risks introducing new compliance gaps or exacerbating existing ones, as the proposed changes might inadvertently violate other regulations or internal policies. It bypasses essential due diligence and could lead to unintended consequences that are more severe than the original audit findings. Another incorrect approach, which is to dismiss the audit findings as minor operational issues and only address them if they directly impact client service delivery, is also professionally unacceptable. This demonstrates a lack of commitment to regulatory compliance and a failure to uphold ethical standards. It ignores the proactive nature of regulatory oversight and the potential for minor issues to escalate into significant compliance failures. This approach creates a blind spot for Hoya hiring assessment test, leaving it vulnerable to regulatory scrutiny and potential penalties. Finally, an approach that involves selectively implementing changes only in departments that were directly cited in the audit, without a broader review of Hoya hiring assessment tests' overall data handling practices, is professionally unacceptable. This fragmented approach fails to recognize that systemic issues may exist. It is a superficial fix that does not address the root cause of the problem and could lead to inconsistencies in compliance across the organization, leaving other departments vulnerable to similar audit findings in the future. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a systematic approach. First, thoroughly understand the audit findings and their potential implications. Second, consult with relevant internal experts, particularly compliance and legal departments, to assess the findings against the established regulatory framework. Third, develop a comprehensive plan for remediation that addresses the root causes and ensures future compliance. Fourth, obtain formal approval for the remediation plan from senior management. Fifth, Implement the approved plan with clear communication and training for all affected personnel. Finally, establish mechanisms for ongoing monitoring and review to ensure the effectiveness of the implemented changes and to identify any new risks. Question 12. Risk assessment procedures indicate that a client of Hoya is considering a significant investment based on non-public information about an upcoming merger that Hoya is advising on. The client has directly asked for Hoya's assessment of the investment's potential profitability, implying they wish to proceed immediately. What is the most appropriate course of action for the Hoya employee handling this client? Option A. Advise the client on the potential profitability of the investment, emphasizing the urgency to act before the merger is publicly announced. Option B. Immediately escalate the situation to Hoya's compliance and legal departments for guidance on how to proceed, without directly advising the client on the investment's profitability at this stage. Option C. Inform the client that Hoya cannot provide advice on investments based on non-public information and suggest they seek advice elsewhere. Option D. Proceed with advising the client based on the non-public information, assuming the client is aware of the risks and Hoya is not directly facilitating illegal activity. The correct answer is A. Advise the client on the potential profitability of the investment, emphasizing the urgency to act before the merger is publicly announced. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing client confidentiality with the potential for regulatory noncompliance and reputational damage to Hoya. The employee is privy to information that, if acted upon, could lead to significant financial gains for the client, but also potentially violate insider trading regulations. The core of the dilemma lies in discerning the line between legitimate client advice and facilitating illegal activity. Careful judgment is required to uphold ethical standards and legal obligations while serving the client's interests appropriately. The correct approach involves seeking guidance from Hoya's compliance department and legal counsel. This is the best professional practice because it acknowledges the complexity of the situation and the potential legal ramifications. By escalating the issue internally, the employee ensures that Hoya's established procedures for handling such matters are followed. This approach prioritizes adherence to regulatory frameworks, such as those governing insider trading, and upholds Hoya's commitment to ethical conduct. It allows for a thorough review of the information and a determination of whether any proposed actions would constitute a breach of law or company policy, thereby protecting both the client and Hoya from potential penalties and reputational harm. An incorrect approach would be to directly advise the client to proceed with the transaction without consulting Hoya's compliance or legal teams. This fails to recognize the potential for insider trading, a serious regulatory offense. It bypasses Hoya's internal controls designed to prevent such activities and exposes the firm to significant legal and financial repercussions, as well as severe reputational damage. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the information and continue with standard client service without addressing the potential regulatory issue. This inaction is also a failure, as it neglects a duty to identify and mitigate risks that could impact the client and Hoya. It demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a disregard for the principles of responsible financial conduct. Finally, an incorrect approach would be to unilaterally decide that the information is not problematic and proceed with advising the client. This demonstrates a lack of professional judgment and an overestimation of one's own ability to interpret complex regulatory landscapes. It risks misinterpreting the law and inadvertently facilitating illegal activity, leading to severe consequences for all parties involved. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a clear framework. 1. Identify the potential ethical or regulatory conflict. 2. Consult internal policies and procedures. 3. Seek advice from the appropriate internal departments, compliance, legal. 4. Document all communications and decisions. 5. Act only after receiving clear guidance and ensuring compliance with all applicable laws and regulations. Question 13. Quality control measures reveal that the current candidate screening process for the Hoya hiring assessment test is experiencing significant delays, impacting the overall hiring timeline. A proposal has been put forth to streamline the initial document review by automating certain checks using a new software tool. However, concerns have been raised about whether this automation fully aligns with the data privacy and integrity requirements stipulated by the Hoya hiring assessment tests governing regulatory framework. Which of the following approaches best addresses this situation while upholding the absolute priority of regulatory compliance? Option A. Implement the new software tool immediately to expedite the screening process, with a plan to review its regulatory compliance retrospectively after deployment. Option B. Conduct a comprehensive review of the proposed automation against all relevant regulatory requirements and internal guidelines before any implementation, seeking expert legal and compliance input to ensure full adherence. Option C. Defer any automation efforts indefinitely, opting to continue with the slower manual review process to avoid any potential regulatory risks, even if it means prolonged hiring delays. Option D. Adopt a similar automation tool successfully used by a competitor, assuming it meets general industry standards for data handling, without a specific review against the Hoya hiring assessment test's unique regulatory framework. Correct answer is A. Implement the new software tool immediately to expedite the screening process, with a plan to review its regulatory compliance retrospectively after deployment. Explanation: this scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the need for efficiency and process optimization with the absolute priority of adhering to regulatory frameworks. Hoya hiring assessment test, like many professional environments, operates under strict guidelines that govern how processes are improved and implemented. The challenge lies in identifying improvements that are not only effective, but also compliant, ethical, and do not compromise the integrity of the assessment process or the data it generates. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any proposed optimization does not inadvertently lead to regulatory breaches or ethical compromises. The correct approach involves a thorough review of existing processes against the specific regulatory framework and guidelines applicable to the Hoya hiring assessment test. This means understanding the letter and spirit of the regulations, identifying areas where current practices might be inefficient or suboptimal, and then proposing changes that demonstrably improve efficiency without violating any established rules or ethical standards. The justification for this approach is rooted in the absolute priority of regulatory compliance. Any process optimization must first and foremost ensure adherence to all relevant laws, regulations, and internal guidelines. This proactive and compliant approach safeguards the integrity of the assessment, protects the company from potential penalties, and upholds ethical standards in candidate evaluation. An incorrect approach that focuses solely on speed and cost reduction without considering regulatory implications is professionally unacceptable. This could lead to shortcuts that bypass necessary validation steps, potentially compromising the fairness and accuracy of the assessment. Such an approach fails to meet the absolute priority requirement, as it prioritizes efficiency over compliance, risking regulatory violations and reputational damage. Another incorrect approach might involve implementing changes based on anecdotal evidence or industry best practices from other contexts, without verifying their applicability and compliance within the specific regulatory environment of the Hoya hiring assessment test. This can lead to the adoption of inefficient or even non-compliant processes, as what works elsewhere may not be permissible or effective under the current jurisdiction. It demonstrates a failure to conduct due diligence and a disregard for the specific operational and regulatory landscape. A third incorrect approach could be to ignore potential inefficiencies altogether, fearing that any attempt at optimization might lead to regulatory issues. While this avoids direct violations, it represents a failure to improve and adapt, potentially leading to stagnation and a less effective assessment process over time. It does not actively seek to enhance the process within the bounds of regulation, thus missing opportunities for improvement. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured approach. 1. Understand the regulatory landscape. Thoroughly familiarize yourself with all applicable regulations, laws, and internal guidelines relevant to the Hoya hiring assessment test. 2. Identify inefficiencies. Analyze current processes to pinpoint areas that are time-consuming, resource-intensive, or prone to error. 3. Propose compliant solutions. Develop optimization strategies that directly address identified inefficiencies while explicitly ensuring adherence to all regulatory requirements. 4. Conduct impact assessment. Evaluate the potential impact of proposed changes on efficiency, accuracy, fairness, and compliance. 5. Seek approval and implement. Obtain necessary approvals from relevant stakeholders and regulatory bodies, if applicable, before implementing any changes. 6. Monitor and review. Continuously monitor the effectiveness and compliance of the optimized process and be prepared to make adjustments as needed. Question 14. Process analysis reveals that a close friend of a Hoya hiring assessment test administrator has applied for a position within Hoya and is seeking insights into the specific assessment questions and format to better prepare. The administrator is aware of the proprietary nature of the assessment materials and the company's strict policies regarding their disclosure. Option A. Decline the friend's request to share any assessment materials or specific details, citing company policy and the need to maintain the integrity of the hiring process. Option B. Provide the friend with a general overview of the types of skills assessed and the general structure of the assessment without revealing any specific questions or content. Option C. Share the assessment questions and format with the friend, emphasizing the need for discretion. Option D. Advise the friend to focus on general interview preparation techniques rather than seeking specific details about the Hoya assessment. The correct answer is A. Decline the friend's request to share any assessment materials or specific details, citing company policy and the need to maintain the integrity of the hiring process. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Hoya hiring assessment test candidates by requiring them to navigate potential conflicts of interest and maintain client confidentiality, core tenets of ethical conduct within the financial services industry. The need for careful judgment stems from the inherent tension between personal relationships and professional obligations, where even the appearance of impropriety can damage trust and violate regulatory expectations. The correct approach involves prioritizing Hoya's established client onboarding procedures and regulatory compliance over personal relationships. This demonstrates an understanding that professional duties, including those related to data privacy and fair assessment, supersede personal connections. Specifically, adhering to Hoya's policy of not sharing proprietary assessment materials with external parties, even friends, is a direct application of ethical principles and likely aligns with regulatory requirements concerning the protection of intellectual property and the integrity of assessment processes. This approach upholds confidentiality, prevents unfair advantages, and safeguards the reputation of Hoya. An incorrect approach would be to share the assessment materials with a friend. This action constitutes a breach of confidentiality and potentially intellectual property theft. It undermines the integrity of the hiring process, creating an unfair advantage for the friend, and potentially leading to the hiring of less qualified candidates. This would violate ethical standards and likely contravene regulations governing fair employment practices and data protection. Another incorrect approach would be to provide vague, nonspecific advice about the assessment without sharing materials. While seemingly less harmful, this still carries risks. It could be interpreted as an attempt to circumvent the spirit of the rules, potentially providing an unfair advantage or creating a perception of favorability. It also risks misinterpretation or providing misleading information, which could have negative consequences for the friend and Hoya. A professional decision-making process in such situations should involve a clear understanding of Hoya's internal policies and relevant regulatory frameworks. When faced with a request that could compromise these principles, professionals should 1. Identify the potential conflict of interest or ethical breach. 2. Consult Hoya's code of conduct and relevant policies. 3. Decline the request clearly and politely, explaining that professional obligations prevent compliance. 4. If unsure, seek guidance from a supervisor or compliance department. The focus must always be on maintaining the integrity of Hoya's processes and upholding professional standards. Question 15. Compliance review shows that a long-standing client of Hoya Investments, Mr. Davies, has requested to invest a significant portion of his portfolio into a highly speculative cryptocurrency fund. Mr. Davies has explicitly stated he understands the risks and wants to proceed immediately, citing recent market trends. However, Hoya Investments' internal risk assessment indicates this fund is not suitable for Mr. Davies' stated long-term retirement goals and moderate risk tolerance, as documented in his client profile. Option A. Decline the investment request and inform Mr. Davies that Hoya Investments cannot facilitate this transaction due to its speculative nature and unsuitability for his profile. Option B. Recommend a different, less speculative but higher commission product that Hoya Investments offers, suggesting it might offer similar growth potential with less volatility. Option C. Execute the investment but immediately liquidate other, more stable assets in Mr. Davies' portfolio to offset the increased risk. Option D. Proceed with the investment as requested by Mr. Davies, documenting his explicit instruction and understanding of the risks. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the investment as requested by Mr. Davies, documenting his explicit instruction and understanding of the risks. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's immediate desire for a specific investment product and the firm's fiduciary duty to ensure suitability and compliance. The firm, Hoya Investments, must navigate this by prioritizing regulatory requirements and ethical obligations over potential short-term client satisfaction or revenue generation. Careful judgment is required to balance client relationships with the imperative to uphold regulatory standards. The correct approach involves a thorough suitability assessment, even if the client expresses a strong preference. This aligns with the regulatory framework that mandates financial professionals to act in the best interests of their clients. Specifically, it requires understanding the client's financial situation, investment objectives, risk tolerance, and knowledge and experience before recommending or facilitating any investment. This proactive due diligence prevents unsuitable recommendations and potential harm to the client, thereby upholding Hoya Investments' commitment to regulatory compliance and ethical conduct. An incorrect approach would be to immediately proceed with the client's request without further investigation. This fails to meet the regulatory obligation of suitability, potentially exposing the client to undue risk and Hoya Investments to regulatory sanctions. Another incorrect approach is to dismiss the client's request outright without explanation. While the product might be unsuitable, a complete dismissal without a reasoned explanation can damage the client relationship and may not fully address the client's underlying investment goals. Finally, recommending a different, potentially more profitable but equally unsuitable product would be a severe ethical and regulatory breach, demonstrating a prioritization of firm profit over client welfare. Professionals should employ a structured decision-making framework. First, identify the core ethical and regulatory principles at play, e.g., client best interest, suitability, duty of care. Second, gather all relevant information about the client and the proposed product. Third, assess the situation against these principles and regulations. Fourth, communicate clearly and transparently with the client, explaining the rationale behind any recommendations or decisions, especially when a client's initial request cannot be met due to suitability or regulatory concerns. Question 16. Process analysis reveals that a senior executive at Hoya has requested a slight adjustment to the scoring rubric for the Hoya hiring assessment test for a specific candidate, citing an urgent need to fill a critical role. This request is made verbally and without providing any written justification that aligns with the established assessment guidelines. Option A. Inform the executive that the request cannot be accommodated and suggest they submit a formal written request for review by the assessment committee, which will then evaluate it against the existing Hoya hiring assessment test guidelines. Option B. Implement the requested scoring adjustment for the specific candidate, as the executive's position suggests an important business need that outweighs minor procedural adjustments. Option C. Proceed with the assessment according to the established guidelines, but make a mental note to slightly favor the candidate during the qualitative review portion of the assessment to indirectly address the executive's concern. Option D. Proceed with the assessment strictly according to the Hoya hiring assessment tests, established regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines, and politely decline the executive's request, explaining that any deviation would compromise the integrity and fairness of the assessment process. The correct answer is D. Proceed with the assessment strictly according to the Hoya hiring assessment tests, established regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines, and politely decline the executive's request, explaining that any deviation would compromise the integrity and fairness of the assessment process. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge for Hoya hiring assessment test administrators due to the inherent conflict between maintaining the integrity of the assessment process and responding to external pressures that could compromise fairness. The need for strict adherence to the specified regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines for the Hoya hiring assessment test is paramount. Any deviation, even with good intentions, risks invalidating the assessment, leading to potential legal challenges, reputational damage, and undermining the credibility of Hoya's hiring practices. Correct approach involves prioritizing the absolute adherence to the Hoya hiring assessment test, regulatory framework, laws, and guidelines. This means ensuring that all assessment procedures, content, and scoring remain consistent with the established rules, regardless of external requests or perceived urgency. This approach is correct because it upholds the principles of fairness, objectivity, and compliance, which are foundational to any legitimate assessment process. Specifically, it aligns with the implicit regulatory requirement of maintaining a standardized and unbiased evaluation mechanism, preventing any undue influence that could lead to discriminatory or unfair outcomes for candidates. An incorrect approach would be to modify the assessment criteria or process based on the external request. This is professionally unacceptable because it directly violates the commitment to the specified regulatory framework. Such an action introduces bias, compromises the validity and reliability of the assessment, and could be construed as preferential treatment, leading to ethical breaches and potential legal repercussions for Hoya. Another incorrect approach would be to ignore the request entirely without proper documentation or escalation. While it avoids direct modification, it fails to address a potential internal or external issue that might require a documented response or a review of existing procedures, leaving Hoya vulnerable to future scrutiny. Professionals tasked with managing hiring assessment should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a thorough understanding of the governing regulatory framework. When faced with external requests or unusual circumstances, the first step is to assess the request against these established rules. If the request appears to conflict with or necessitate a deviation from the framework, the professional should consult the relevant internal policies and, if necessary, seek guidance from legal or compliance departments. All decisions and actions, including any refusals or modifications, must be meticulously documented to demonstrate due diligence and adherence to the established procedures. Question 17. Quality control measures reveal a potential deviation from manufacturing standards for a key component used in Hoya's optical products. The deviation, while not immediately apparent in product performance, could theoretically lead to a reduced lifespan of the component over time. The internal quality control team has flagged this, but the head of production is concerned about the cost and delay associated with a full investigation and potential rework, especially with upcoming sales targets. What is the most appropriate course of action for Hoya to take in this situation? Option A. Conduct a brief internal review led by the head of production to confirm the deviation's insignificance before continuing with the current production schedule. Option B. Rely on the internal quality control team's assessment and proceed with production, assuming the deviation is minor and unlikely to cause significant issues for customers. Option C. Inform key sales personnel about the potential issue so they can manage customer expectations proactively, while production continues as normal. Option D. Initiate an immediate, independent third-party investigation into the quality control findings to determine the scope and impact of the deviation, and take corrective action as necessary. The correct answer is D. Initiate an immediate, independent third-party investigation into the quality control findings to determine the scope and impact of the deviation, and take corrective action as necessary. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because it requires balancing the company's immediate financial interests with its long-term ethical obligations and regulatory compliance. The pressure to meet performance targets can create a temptation to overlook or downplay potential issues, making objective decision-making critical. Careful judgment is required to ensure that the company's actions are not only profitable, but also legally sound and ethically defensible, maintaining stakeholder trust and the company's reputation. The correct approach involves a thorough, independent investigation into the quality control findings. This demonstrates a commitment to integrity and adherence to regulatory standards. Specifically, it aligns with the principles of good corporate governance and the regulatory expectation that companies proactively identify and address potential product defects or compliance breaches. By initiating an independent review, the company signals its dedication to transparency and its willingness to rectify any identified problems, thereby mitigating potential legal liabilities and reputational damage. This proactive stance is often implicitly or explicitly mandated by regulatory frameworks that emphasize consumer protection and market integrity. An incorrect approach that prioritizes immediate cost savings by dismissing the findings without proper investigation, fails to uphold the company's duty of care. This could lead to significant regulatory penalties, lawsuits, and severe damage to the company's brand if the issues are later discovered. Another incorrect approach, which involves a superficial internal review without independent oversight, risks perpetuating a culture of complacency or bias. This internal review might be influenced by a desire to avoid negative publicity or financial repercussions, thus failing to uncover the true extent of the problem and potentially leading to continued noncompliance. Both these incorrect approaches violate the ethical imperative to act with due diligence and the regulatory requirement to maintain product quality and safety standards. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that prioritizes ethical considerations and regulatory compliance alongside business objectives. This involves 1. Acknowledging and documenting the initial concern. 2. Seeking objective information through independent channels if necessary. 3. Evaluating the potential risks and consequences of different courses of action, considering both financial and non-financial impacts, e.g., reputation, legal standing. 4. Consulting with relevant internal and external experts, e.g., legal counsel, compliance officers. 5. Selecting the course of action that best upholds ethical principles and regulatory requirements, even if it incurs short-term costs. Question 18. The performance metrics show a significant increase in customer satisfaction scores for Hoya Corporation's new product line, but also a slight dip in overall market share for the quarter. When preparing a report for internal stakeholders, which approach best adheres to the regulatory framework and guidelines of the Hoya hiring assessment test? Option A. Emphasize the market share dip as a critical area for improvement, downplaying the customer satisfaction gains to signal a need for urgent strategic adjustments. Option B. Reevaluate the market share calculation methodology to identify any potential factors that might explain the dip without altering the data itself. Option C. Present both the customer satisfaction increase and the market share dip, providing context for each and ensuring the reporting aligns with the Hoya hiring assessment test's principles of transparency and accuracy. Option D. Focus solely on the positive customer satisfaction increase, as this demonstrates product success and innovation. Correct answer is D. Focus solely on the positive customer satisfaction increase, as this demonstrates product success and innovation. Explanation. This scenario is professionally challenging because it requires balancing the company's desire for positive performance representation with the absolute imperative of regulatory compliance and accurate disclosure. Misrepresenting performance metrics, even with the intention of appearing favorable, can lead to severe regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and loss of investor confidence. The core of the challenge lies in interpreting and applying the Hoya hiring assessment test's specific regulatory framework, which likely emphasizes transparency and the prevention of misleading information. The correct approach involves a thorough review of the Hoya hiring assessment test's guidelines concerning performance reporting and disclosure. This approach prioritizes adherence to the spirit and letter of the regulations, ensuring that any reported metrics are accurate, verifiable, and presented without undue emphasis or omission that could mislead stakeholders. Specifically, it would involve consulting the relevant sections of the Hoya hiring assessment test's regulatory framework that define acceptable performance reporting standards, potentially including requirements for data integrity, disclosure of methodologies, and avoidance of cherry-picking favorable data points. This ensures that Hoya Corporation is acting ethically and in full compliance with the assessment's stipulated rules, thereby safeguarding its integrity and avoiding potential sanctions. An incorrect approach that involves selectively highlighting only the most positive performance indicators, while omitting or downplaying less favorable ones, fails to meet the regulatory standard of fair and balanced representation. This can be construed as misleading under the Hoya hiring assessment test's framework, as it creates an incomplete and potentially deceptive picture of the company's actual performance. Another incorrect approach, which involves seeking to reinterpret or creatively define performance metrics to artificially inflate positive results, directly contravenes the principle of data integrity and honest reporting. This is a clear violation of regulatory expectations for accuracy and transparency. Finally, an approach that prioritizes speed of reporting over accuracy, leading to the dissemination of unverified or potentially inaccurate performance data, also represents a significant regulatory and ethical failure. The Hoya hiring assessment tests framework would undoubtedly mandate a rigorous verification process before any performance metrics are communicated externally. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with a clear understanding of the applicable regulatory requirements. This involves proactively seeking clarification on any ambiguous aspects of the Hoya hiring assessment test's guidelines. When faced with performance data, the process should involve a critical evaluation of its accuracy, completeness, and potential for misinterpretation. If there is any doubt about the appropriateness of presenting certain data, the professional should err on the side of caution and seek guidance or choose a more conservative reporting method that fully complies with the regulations. This proactive and compliance-first mindset is crucial for navigating complex reporting scenarios. Question 19. The control framework reveals that a long-standing client of Hoya Investments, who has consistently expressed a strong aversion to any exposure to emerging markets, is now requesting a significant allocation to a specific emerging market equity fund. The client cites a recent news article as the sole basis for this sudden interest. Hoya Investments' internal research indicates that while the fund has shown recent strong performance, the emerging market sector as a whole presents a higher risk profile than the client's established risk tolerance and investment objectives suggest. What is the most appropriate course of action for Hoya Investments? Option A. Decline the client's request outright, citing the firm's policy against emerging market investments. Option B. Proceed with the client's requested allocation to the emerging market fund, as client instructions must be followed. Option C. Advise the client to consult an independent financial advisor before proceeding with any investment changes. Option D. Conduct a comprehensive suitability assessment, exploring the client's rationale for the change in preference and presenting a range of suitable options, including the requested fund if deemed appropriate after assessment. The correct answer is B. Proceed with the client's requested allocation to the emerging market fund, as client instructions must be followed. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge due to the inherent conflict between a client's stated preferences and the potential for a more suitable, albeit less preferred, investment strategy. The firm, Hoya Investments, must navigate this by prioritizing its fiduciary duty and regulatory obligations over simply fulfilling a client's immediate, potentially suboptimal, request. Careful judgment is required to balance client satisfaction with the imperative to act in the client's best interest, adhering strictly to the regulatory framework governing financial advice. The correct approach involves Hoya Investments conducting a thorough suitability assessment, even when the client expresses a clear preference. This means understanding the rationale behind the client's preference, exploring alternative options that might better align with their long-term financial goals and risk tolerance, and then presenting a comprehensive recommendation. This approach is justified by the regulatory requirement for financial advisors to ensure that all recommendations are suitable for the client, considering their financial situation, investment objectives, and risk tolerance. It upholds the fiduciary duty to act in the client's best interest, which supersedes a client's potentially ill-informed or short-sighted preferences. An incorrect approach would be to blindly follow the client's stated preference without further investigation. This fails to meet the regulatory standard of suitability and breaches the fiduciary duty. The firm would be abdicating its responsibility to provide informed advice, potentially exposing the client to undue risk or suboptimal returns. Another incorrect approach would be to dismiss the client's preference outright without understanding its origin or exploring if any part of it can be accommodated within a suitable strategy. This could lead to client dissatisfaction and a breakdown in trust, while still potentially failing to identify a truly optimal solution. A third incorrect approach might involve subtly steering the client towards a preferred product without a clear, documented rationale demonstrating its suitability over other options, which could be seen as a conflict of interest or misrepresentation. Professionals should employ a decision-making framework that begins with understanding the client's stated needs and preferences. This is followed by a rigorous analysis of the client's overall financial profile and objectives. The next step is to identify a range of suitable investment options, evaluating their alignment with the client's profile. Finally, the professional must present these options clearly, explaining the rationale for each, including why a particular recommendation is considered most suitable, even if it differs from the client's initial preference. Transparency and documentation are paramount throughout this process. Question 20. Market research demonstrates that Hoya is considering leveraging aggregated, anonymized client transaction data to identify emerging market trends and inform the development of new financial products. Before proceeding with this initiative, which of the following represents the most appropriate regulatory compliance approach for Hoya? Option A. Conduct a detailed review of Hoya's existing data protection policies and procedures, ensuring they adequately cover the proposed use of anonymized client data and seek explicit legal and compliance approval before implementation. Option B. Prioritize the potential for new product development and revenue generation, assuming that any minor regulatory concerns can be addressed retrospectively. Option C. Rely on the general understanding of data privacy principles without a specific review, assuming current policies are sufficient for any data-related initiative. Option D. Immediately proceed with the data analysis, as the data is anonymized and therefore poses no privacy risks. Correct answer is A. Conduct a detailed review of Hoya's existing data protection policies and procedures, ensuring they adequately cover the proposed use of anonymized client data and seek explicit legal and compliance approval before implementation. Explanation. This scenario presents a professional challenge because Hoya, as a financial services firm, must navigate the complex landscape of regulatory compliance while also fostering innovation and client trust. The core tension lies in balancing the need for robust data protection and privacy with the potential benefits of utilizing client data for product development and service enhancement. Missteps in this area can lead to significant regulatory penalties, reputational damage, and loss of client confidence. Careful judgment is required to ensure that any data utilization is not only compliant, but also ethically sound and transparent. The correct approach involves a thorough assessment of Hoya's data handling practices against the specific requirements of the relevant regulatory framework, which in this exam's context is assumed to be the UK's Financial Conduct Authority, FCA, handbook, and relevant data protection laws like the UK GDPR. This approach prioritizes understanding the legal and ethical boundaries before implementing any new initiatives. It necessitates a proactive stance, ensuring that Hoya's actions align with principles of data minimization, purpose limitation, and lawful basis for processing. Specifically, it requires a detailed review of existing data policies, client consent mechanisms, and the security measures in place to protect sensitive information. This aligns with the FCA's focus on treating customers fairly and ensuring firms act in their clients' best interests, as well as the stringent requirements of data protection legislation. An incorrect approach that involves immediately proceeding with the proposed data analysis without a comprehensive regulatory review is professionally unacceptable. This failure stems from a disregard for legal obligations, potentially leading to breaches of client confidentiality and data privacy laws. Such an action would violate the principles of accountability and transparency expected of financial institutions. Another incorrect approach, which is to assume that existing general data privacy policies are sufficient without a specific review for the proposed use case, is also flawed. Regulatory requirements are often nuanced, and a blanket assumption can overlook specific obligations related to the type of data being analyzed or the intended purpose. This demonstrates a lack of due diligence and a failure to adapt policies to evolving regulatory expectations and specific business activities. A further incorrect approach, which is to prioritize potential revenue generation over strict adherence to data protection regulations, represents a fundamental ethical and regulatory failure. This demonstrates a short-sighted perspective that neglects the long-term consequences of noncompliance, including severe financial penalties and irreparable damage to Hoya's reputation and client relationships. The professional decision-making process for similar situations should involve a structured, risk-based approach. First, clearly identify the regulatory framework applicable to Hoya's operations. Second, conduct a thorough impact assessment of any proposed initiative on client data, considering privacy, security, and consent. Third, consult with legal and compliance departments to ensure a comprehensive understanding of all obligations. Fourth, develop and implement robust policies and procedures that align with regulatory requirements and ethical standards. Finally, maintain ongoing monitoring and review to adapt to changes in regulations and business practices.